Picture a November night in 1120, somewhere off the coast of Normandy. The waters of the English Channel are dark and cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and doesn't let go. A brand new ship, the finest vessel money could buy, cuts through the waves with confidence. On board, roughly 300 souls are celebrating. Young nobles, the cream of Anglo-Norman society, are drinking and laughing. The wine flows freely. They're racing to catch up to another ship ahead of them, the one carrying King Henry I of England. It's all a game, a drunken challenge. The captain, Thomas Fitzstephen, is equally drunk, equally confident. His father captained the ship that brought William the Conqueror across this very channel back in 1066. He's got heritage, he's got a fast ship, and he's got an audience demanding speed. And then, with a sound that would echo through centuries of English history, the ship strikes a rock. The White Ship, as it was called, goes down in minutes. The icy November water claims nearly everyone. Nobles in their fine clothes, heavy with embroidery and jewels, sink like stones. The screaming doesn't last long. By morning, only one man survives, a butcher named Berold, who clung to a piece of wreckage all through that endless freezing night. His cheap sheepskin clothes, the kind no nobleman would be caught dead in, kept him just warm enough to make it. The irony wouldn't have been lost on anyone at the time. Among the dead was William Adelin, the 17-year-old heir to the throne of England, the only legitimate son of Henry I, the boy who was supposed to inherit everything his grandfather William the Conqueror had built. According to the chronicles, William actually made it into a lifeboat. He could have survived, but he heard his half-sister screaming for help, still trapped on the sinking ship. He ordered the boat back. Too many people tried to climb aboard the small vessel, and it capsized. William drowned with the rest of them. When news reached King Henry, he collapsed. Contemporary sources say he never smiled again. And who could blame him? In one night, an entire generation of English nobility had been wiped out. But more than that, Henry's carefully constructed plans for succession had just sunk to the bottom of the English Channel along with his son. Now Henry had plenty of children. The man was notorious for it. He fathered at least 20 illegitimate children by various mistresses, more than any other English king before or since. But in the brutal arithmetic of medieval inheritance, bastards didn't count. They couldn't inherit the throne, couldn't continue the legitimate royal line. And Henry's wife, Matilda of Scotland, had given him only 2 legitimate children. William, who now lay dead somewhere in the cold waters off Barfleur, and a daughter. Just a daughter. Her name was Matilda, and she was about to become one of the most controversial figures in English medieval history. A woman who came within touching distance of being crowned Queen of England, who fought a 19-year civil war for her rights, who never backed down and never surrendered. A woman who was proclaimed Lady of the English, who issued royal charters, who ruled in everything but name. And yet, when most people today think about the first Queen of England, they think of Mary Tudor in 1553. More than 400 years later, Matilda has been almost completely erased from popular memory, written out of the history books, reduced to a footnote in the reign of her son Henry II. But here's the thing about Matilda. She was fierce, she was brilliant, she was absolutely, uncompromisingly determined. And for a few crucial months in 1141, she was effectively the ruler of England. The first woman to hold that position, the Queen they tried to forget. So let's remember her. Matilda was born in February of 1102, probably at Winchester, the ancient capital of Wessex. She was born into a world of stone castles and cold stone churches, of manuscript illuminations and the smell of beeswax candles. Her father was King Henry I, the youngest son of William the Conqueror, and her mother was Matilda of Scotland, herself descended from the old Anglo-Saxon kings of England. Through her veins ran both Norman and Saxon blood, the conqueror and the conquered mixed together. It was a potent combination. As a royal daughter, young Matilda would have been raised in comfort, certainly. but also with the constant awareness that she was a valuable political asset. Medieval princesses were diplomatic currency, to be married off to forge alliances and secure territories. Matilda's fate was sealed when she was just 8 years old. Her father had negotiated a marriage alliance with the Holy Roman Empire, the sprawling collection of territories that covered much of modern Germany, Austria, and northern Italy. The Holy Roman Emperor, Henry V, needed a wife. King Henry of England needed a powerful ally. And so, in 1110, an 8-year-old girl was sent across the sea to Germany, probably never expecting to see her mother again. Think about that for a moment. 8 years old, shipped off to a foreign land where they spoke a different language, followed different customs, worshipped in a slightly different way even though both countries were Catholic. Separated from her family, from everything familiar, thrust into the intricate and cutthroat politics of the imperial court. Most children would have been utterly overwhelmed. Most would have retreated into themselves, become meek and pliable, just tried to survive. Matilda thrived. She was placed under the care of Archbishop Bruno of Trier, who educated her in German language and culture, in the arts of governance and diplomacy, in the complex web of relationships that made up the Holy Roman Empire. And Matilda proved to be an exceptional student. She learned German. She learned the rituals of imperial power. She learned how to navigate court politics, how to identify allies and enemies, how to hold her own in a world of powerful men who might have been inclined to dismiss her as just a child bride. When she actually married Henry V in January 1114, Matilda was 12 years old. Henry was about 33. The marriage ceremony took place at Worms Cathedral, a soaring Gothic structure that must have seemed impossibly grand to the young bride. She was crowned Holy Roman Empress, a title of immense prestige that put her theoretically above every other queen in Europe. For the next 11 years, Matilda lived as Empress. She travelled with Henry on his campaigns into Italy. She learned statecraft. She acted as his representative when he was absent. Contemporary sources describe her as intelligent, capable, and increasingly confident in her role. But she and Henry had no children. In an age when a woman's primary value was seen as her ability to produce heirs, this was a serious problem. Whether the fault lay with Matilda or Henry or some combination of factors, we can't know. What we do know is that when Henry V died in 1125, Matilda was 23 years old, widowed, childless, and facing an uncertain future. She returned to her father's court in Normandy, bringing with her the impressive title of Empress and 11 years of experience governing one of Europe's most complex political entities. She also brought with her a sense of her own worth and capability that would serve her well in the battles to come. But she had no idea just how crucial those qualities would become, because 4 years after Matilda's return to England, on that cold November night in 1120, her brother William climbed aboard the White Ship. And when the sun rose the next morning, Matilda was the only legitimate child King Henry had left. King Henry was 53 years old when William died. He remarried quickly, hoping to father another son. His new wife, Adeliza of Louvain, was young, beautiful, and from good family. But year after year passed, and no children came. By 1126, it was clear that Henry needed to face reality. His daughter Matilda was going to be his heir. This was unprecedented. There had never been a queen regnant of England. Women could be queen's consort, wives of kings, mothers of kings, but a woman ruling in her own right, holding court, commanding armies, making laws. The idea was radical, almost unthinkable. In Wessex there had been a tradition going back centuries that explicitly forbade crowning the king's wife as queen, let alone allowing a woman to rule. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle made it clear the consorts of kings were not to be called queen, but simply the king's wife. This stemmed from an ancient scandal involving Queen Edba of Mercia, who had allegedly poisoned people at the court of Wessex. The stain of her crimes had tainted the very idea of queenship for generations. But Henry was desperate. He had spent 26. Years building up England's power and stability. He had reformed the treasury, strengthened royal justice, and kept the peace. He could not let his life's work crumble into a succession crisis after his death. So in the Christmas court of 1126, Henry made his move. He summoned all his barons, the great lords who held lands and castles across England and Normandy, and he made them swear an oath. They would recognise Matilda as his heir. They would accept her as Lady of the English after his death. They would support her claim to the throne. The first to swear was David, King of Scotland, Matilda's uncle. Then came Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew. Then Robert of Gloucester, Henry's illegitimate but powerful son. One by one, the great men of the realm knelt before the king and swore their oaths. But you can imagine the grumbling afterward, the private conversations in castle halls and monastery cloisters, a woman ruling England, commanding their allegiance. It went against everything they'd been taught about the natural order of things. Women were seen as weak, emotional, easily swayed. The medieval mind couldn't easily wrap itself around the concept of a woman wielding that kind of power. Still, while Henry lived, the barons kept their oaths. Henry was, as one historian put it, absolutely terrifying. He had his father William the Conqueror's ruthlessness combined with a sharp legal mind and a long memory for anyone who crossed him. Nobody wanted to be on Henry's bad side, so they smiled and bowed and swore their oaths, and they probably assumed they'd figure something out when the old king finally died. Henry wasn't done with Matilda yet, though. He needed to secure the succession further, and that meant she needed to marry again and produce an heir. The man Henry chose was Geoffrey Plantagenet, the 15-year-old son of Fulk, Count of Anjou. Anjou was a powerful county in France that bordered Normandy, and Henry had long wanted to neutralise it as a potential threat. Marrying Matilda to Geoffrey would turn an enemy into an ally. There was just one problem. Matilda absolutely did not want to marry Geoffrey. Think about it from her perspective. She had been Holy Roman Empress. She had been married to one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. She'd governed territories, mediated disputes, lived in palaces and presided over courts. She was 26 years old and had more political experience than most men twice her age. And now her father wanted her to marry a 15-year-old boy, the son of a count. Not even a king, just a count. It was a massive step down in status, and Matilda knew it. She fought the marriage. She argued. She refused. But Henry was adamant. The political alliance was too important. In June 1128, despite all her objections, Matilda married Geoffrey Plantagenet in the cathedral at Le Mans. It was a disaster of a marriage from the start. Geoffrey got his nickname Plantagenet from his habit of wearing a sprig of bright yellow broomflower, Plantagenista, in his hat or helmet. He was handsome, charming, and ambitious. He was also much younger than Matilda, and the two of them despised each other almost on sight. Matilda insisted on being called Empress for the rest of her life, refusing to let anyone forget her superior status. Geoffrey resented her hauteur and her constant reminders that she had once been married to an emperor. They fought constantly. They separated multiple times. Contemporary sources make it clear that theirs was not a love match, but they did their duty. In March 1133, Matilda gave birth to a son at Le Mans. They named him Henry, after his grandfather. The old king was delighted. He travelled to Rouen to see his new grandson, and the chronicles say he was so happy he dandled the baby on his knee, cooing over him like any doting grandfather. Another son, Geoffrey, was born in 1134, though Matilda nearly died in childbirth. A third son, William, would follow later. Henry I now had a daughter who was his designated heir, and a grandson to continue the line after her. The succession seemed secure. The old king could rest easy knowing his dynasty would continue, but nothing is ever quite that simple. In the summer of 1135, Henry travelled once more to Normandy. He visited Matilda and Geoffrey, saw his grandsons, attended to various administrative matters. He also had a massive argument with Matilda and Geoffrey, though the sources don't tell us exactly what it was about. Some historians speculate that Matilda and Geoffrey wanted Henry to hand over control of certain Norman castles immediately to strengthen their position for when the succession happened. Henry refused. The meeting ended badly. On the night of December 1st, 1135, King Henry I ate a meal of lampreys. Lampreys are an eel-like fish that medieval nobility apparently considered a delicacy, despite them being oily and rich and generally hard to digest. Henry ate too many. He fell ill that night. Within days, he was dead. He was 67 years old. He had ruled England for 35 years, and despite all his careful planning, all those oaths sworn by his barons, everything was about to fall apart. Matilda was in Anjou with Geoffrey when she received news of her father's death. Geoffrey was dealing with a rebellion in his own territories. Neither of them could drop everything and rush to England immediately. That delay would prove fatal to Matilda's cause. Because Stephen of Blois was in Boulogne when Henry died, much closer to England, and Stephen, who had sworn an oath to support Matilda, who had knelt before the old king and promised on holy relics to uphold her succession, decided that those oaths didn't matter anymore. Stephen was Henry's nephew, son of the old king's sister Adela. He'd grown up at Henry's court. He was a Norman baron with lands on both sides of the Channel. He was also married to Matilda of Boulogne, an immensely wealthy heiress who could fund his ambitions. And Stephen had a crucial advantage that Empress Matilda lacked. He was a man. Stephen moved with devastating speed. He crossed the Channel to England within days of Henry's death. He rode straight for London and secured the support of the city. He convinced the Archbishop of Canterbury to crown him, and crucially, he got to Winchester, where the royal treasury was kept, before anyone could stop him. His younger brother, Henry of Blois, was Bishop of Winchester, and Henry used his considerable influence to throw the weight of the church behind Stephen's claim. On December 22nd, 1135, just 3 weeks after King Henry's death, Stephen of Blois was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey. When news reached Matilda, she must have been incandescent with rage. Her father had made the barons swear oaths, multiple oaths, on multiple occasions. They had all promised to support her. And at the first test, at the very moment those oaths should have meant something, they had all broken them. Stephen had broken his oath. The Archbishop had broken his oath. The barons had broken their oaths. They had looked at a choice between a man and a woman, and they had chosen the man, oaths be damned. But Matilda had not spent 11 years as Holy Roman Empress, had not learned statecraft and diplomacy and the arts of power, just to meekly accept being shoved aside. If Stephen wanted the crown, he was going to have to fight for it. For the first few years, though, Matilda couldn't do much fighting. She and Geoffrey were focused on Normandy, trying to establish control there. Normandy was crucial. It was the duchy that William the Conqueror had ruled before conquering England, and it was immensely wealthy and strategically important. If Matilda could control Normandy, she would have a power base from which to attack England. In England, meanwhile, Stephen was finding out that being king was rather more difficult than seizing the crown. He was generous to a fault, handing out lands and titles and favours to anyone who asked, trying to buy loyalty. But generosity can look like weakness, and the barons began to see Stephen as someone they could manipulate. He also made the catastrophic mistake of arresting Roger, Bishop of Salisbury, along with the bishop's nephew and son, and seizing their castles. Roger had been one of Henry I's most trusted administrators, practically running the government in the old king's absence. By attacking Roger, Stephen managed to alienate the church without actually gaining much in return. His brother Henry, the Bishop of Winchester, was furious. By 1139 the situation had deteriorated enough that Matilda decided it was time to invade. In September of that year she landed at Arundel on the south coast of England with a small force. She was accompanied by her half-brother Robert of Gloucester, Henry I's illegitimate but enormously capable son. Robert was one of the most powerful barons in England, controlling vast estates in the West Country. He had finally decided to openly rebel against Stephen and support his half-sister's claim. Matilda's arrival sparked the beginning of what would later be called the Anarchy, a period of civil war that would drag on for 14 years and tear England apart. Stephen, to his credit, reacted quickly. He besieged Matilda at Arundel Castle, but then he made one of the most baffling decisions of the entire war. Instead of pressing the siege and potentially capturing Matilda, thus ending the conflict before it really began, he allowed her to leave Arundel under safe conduct and join Robert of Gloucester in the west. Various theories have been proposed for why Stephen did this. Some historians think he was being chivalrous, reluctant to imprison a woman of royal blood. Others think he was being clever, calculating that it was better to have all his enemies gathered in one place rather than scattered around the country. Still others think he was simply being foolish. Whatever his reasoning, it was a terrible mistake. Matilda made it safely to Bristol, Robert's stronghold, and established her headquarters there. The West Country became her power base, and the real fighting began. The civil war that followed was brutal and chaotic. Castles changed hands repeatedly. Barons switched sides depending on which way the wind was blowing. The bonds of loyalty that had held medieval society together began to fracture. It was a war where nobody could win decisively, but everyone could lose everything. Contemporary chronicles paint a grim picture. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes Stephen's reign as a time when Christ and his saints slept. Unauthorised castles sprang up all over the countryside, built by petty lords who took advantage of the chaos to establish their own little kingdoms. Peasants were subjected to arbitrary taxation and violence. Crops were burned. Villages were destroyed. Some areas of the country descended into near anarchy, hence the period's name. But through it all, Matilda persisted. She was based at Gloucester, surrounded by her supporters, including her uncle King David of Scotland, who had invaded northern England to support her claim. Her half-brother Robert of Gloucester commanded her military forces. Her husband Geoffrey continued to conquer castles in Normandy, slowly and methodically taking over the duchy. And in 1141, Matilda's fortunes took a dramatic turn. On February 2nd, 1141, a major battle took place at Lincoln. King Stephen's forces clashed with an army led by Robert of Gloucester and Ranulph, Earl of Chester, who had recently defected from Stephen's side. The battle was fierce. Stephen fought bravely, wielding a sword until it broke, then grabbing a battle-axe and fighting on. But eventually he was overwhelmed, surrounded, and captured. The King of England was now Matilda's prisoner. This was it. This was the moment Matilda had been fighting for. With Stephen imprisoned, the way was clear for her to take the throne. She moved quickly to consolidate her position. She had Stephen imprisoned at Bristol Castle, the same castle where she had established her base of operations years earlier. There was a certain poetic justice to that. Then Matilda travelled to Winchester, the old Anglo-Saxon capital where the royal treasury was kept. Her brother Henry of Blois, yes, the same man who had supported Stephen's coronation, now switched sides. He was nothing if not pragmatic, and with Stephen captured, he saw which way the wind was blowing. On March 2nd, Henry convened a church council at Winchester. In front of assembled bishops and abbots, he formally proclaimed Matilda Domina Anglorum, Lady of the English. This title is crucial and worth examining. Matilda didn't style herself Regina, Queen. That word in medieval Latin and in the minds of medieval people specifically meant the wife of a king. There was no precedent in England for a woman ruling in her own right, no word that quite fit what Matilda was claiming to be, so she used Domina, lady or mistress, the female equivalent of Dominus, to lord. It was a title that emphasised her role as a ruler, as someone exercising temporal power in her own right. In the weeks and months that followed, Matilda acted in every way as England's ruler. She issued charters, legal documents granting lands or rights or privileges. She held court, She received the submissions and homage of barons who had previously supported Stephen. She appointed officials. She made decisions about church matters. She did all the things a monarch did, everything except actually be crowned, and that's where things started to go wrong. In June 1141, Matilda travelled to London to arrange her coronation. The ceremony was scheduled for June 24th, the feast of St. John the Baptist. This was to be her triumph, the moment when Matilda would officially become Queen of England, the first woman to rule the kingdom in her own right. She must have felt that all her years of struggle, all the battles and sieges and political manoeuvring had finally paid off. But Matilda had a problem, one that contemporary sources are very explicit about. She was arrogant. She was haughty. She had a temper. She did not suffer fools gladly. After everything she had endured, being married off as a child, widowed, forced into a second marriage she didn't want, seeing her inheritance stolen by her cousin, fighting a brutal civil war, she was not inclined to be conciliatory or to play the humble supplicant. She had earned this throne through blood and fire, and she was going to rule on her own terms. The people of London wanted concessions. They wanted tax relief. They wanted reassurance. They wanted their new ruler to be gracious and generous, to follow the traditions that said a new monarch should grant favours and ease burdens. Instead, Matilda demanded money. London was wealthy, and she needed funds to pay her soldiers and supporters. When the Londoners came to her with their petitions and requests, she was dismissive. She refused to grant the tax concessions they asked for. Her manner was imperious and cold. And Stephen's queen, Matilda of Boulogne, yes, another Matilda, because medieval England apparently couldn't get enough of that name, was busy rallying support for her imprisoned husband. Queen Matilda was popular in London. She had been cultivating relationships with the city's merchants and guilds. She had money, since she was independently wealthy through her own inheritance, and she used both her personal charm and her considerable resources to turn London against Empress Matilda. On June 24th, 1141, the day that was supposed to be Empress Matilda's coronation, London erupted. A mob of citizens, possibly encouraged by Queen Matilda's agents, rose up in violent protest. They rang the city's alarm bells. They took to the streets. They were done with this arrogant foreign empress who treated them with such contempt. They wanted King Stephen back. Empress Matilda and her supporters had to flee. They literally ran from London, abandoning the coronation, abandoning their plans, riding hard to escape the angry mob. Matilda made it to Oxford, but the humiliation must have been crushing. She had been so close. The crown had been within her grasp, and she had lost it because she couldn't or wouldn't bend, couldn't play the political game of charm and concession that was expected of rulers. But the disaster wasn't over yet. Matilda returned to Winchester, trying to regroup and figure out her next moves. But Queen Matilda's forces followed her there. A siege developed, with Empress Matilda's forces trapped in Winchester, while Queen Matilda's army surrounded them. It was a chaotic, confused battle. In September 1141, Empress Matilda's forces tried to break out of Winchester. In the fighting that followed, Robert of Gloucester, Matilda's half-brother, her most capable military commander, the man who had been her chief support from the beginning, was captured. This was a catastrophe. Without Robert, Matilda's cause was crippled. She needed him. She couldn't afford to lose him. And so, in one of the most controversial decisions of the entire Civil War, Matilda agreed to a prisoner exchange. She would release King Stephen from prison in exchange for Robert of Gloucester. Historians have debated this decision for centuries. By all normal standards of warfare, it was the right thing to do. You don't abandon your key commander. You negotiate for his release. That's how the medieval rules of war worked. But in this case, it meant releasing the enemy king. Stephen, once free, immediately rallied his forces and took the field against Matilda again. All the gains she had made since the Battle of Lincoln evaporated. They were back to stalemate, back to grinding siege warfare and castle-taking and burned villages. Many historians have argued that Matilda should have been more ruthless. She should have kept Stephen imprisoned or even executed him. A male king, they suggest, would never have made such a sentimental decision. But we can't really know what drove Matilda's choice. Maybe it was love for her brother. Maybe it was loyalty, that most valued of medieval virtues. Maybe it was a calculation that she couldn't hold her coalition together without Robert. Maybe she simply couldn't bring herself to condemn her cousin to death or eternal imprisonment, no matter how much he had wronged her. We'll never know for certain. What we do know is that the war dragged on. And in 1142, Matilda found herself in one of the most desperate situations of her entire life, trapped in Oxford Castle with Stephen's forces surrounding her on all sides. The siege of Oxford began in September 1142. King Stephen, having regained the initiative after his release, decided to strike at one of Matilda's key strongholds. Oxford Castle was strategically important, controlling a major crossing of the Thames River and the roads that connected the West Country to London. If Stephen could take it, he could cut Matilda's supply lines and isolate her supporters. Stephen's army surrounded the city. He took the town quickly, then settled in for a long siege of the castle itself. Medieval sieges were wars of attrition. The attackers would try to starve out the defenders, occasionally launching assaults with siege engines and towers, while the defenders hoped that relief would come before their food ran out. This siege lasted through September, October, November. By early December, conditions in the castle were dire. Food stocks were nearly exhausted. The garrison was on the edge of starvation, and it was becoming clear that no relief force was coming. Matilda was trapped. But Matilda had not survived this long by giving up. If there was no way to hold Oxford Castle, then she would have to escape. And so, on a December night in 1142, one of the most daring escapes in English history took place. The details vary depending on which medieval chronicle you read, but the core story is consistent. Matilda, accompanied by 3 or 4 of her most trusted knights, snuck out of the castle in the dead of night. Some sources say she was lowered from the walls on a rope. Others suggest she slipped out through a postern gate. What most chronicles agree on is that she wore white, a white cloak, white clothes, as camouflage against the snow that blanketed the ground. It had been snowing heavily. The world was white and still and bitterly cold. The Thames had frozen over. Stephen's soldiers were huddled around their watchfires, probably more concerned with staying warm than with watching for an escape they didn't think was possible. And through this frozen landscape, past the sleeping guards, Matilda walked, or possibly crept, or ran. The chronicles aren't entirely clear. She made it across the frozen Thames using the ice as a bridge, 6 miles through the snow and the freezing night air, dressed in white, practically invisible against the winter landscape. Eventually she reached Abingdon, where she was able to get horses. From there she rode to Wallingford Castle, one of her strongholds, where she was finally safe. When morning came and Stephen's soldiers discovered that their prize had slipped away, the reaction must have been a mixture of disbelief and grudging admiration. The castle garrison surrendered the next day. Without Matilda, there was no point in holding out any longer. But Stephen had lost his chance to capture the Empress, and Matilda had escaped death or imprisonment through sheer audacity and courage. It's a story that deserves to be remembered, this image of a 40-year-old woman walking through the snow in the middle of the night, refusing to surrender, refusing to give up. But like so much of Matilda's story, it's been overshadowed, relegated to a footnote, treated as just one incident in a larger war that itself is often treated as a footnote between the Norman conquest and the rise of the Plantagenets. The escape from Oxford was perhaps Matilda's finest moment, but the war was grinding her down. In 1147, her half-brother Robert of Gloucester died. Robert had been her rock, her most loyal supporter, the military commander who had kept her cause alive through years of setbacks. Without him, Matilda's position became untenable. In 1148, worn down by years of fighting, seeing no clear path to victory, she returned to Normandy. She never set foot in England again. But Matilda did not give up on her claim. She simply changed tactics. Her son, Henry Plantagenet, was now 15 years old enough to carry on the fight. Matilda had spent years teaching him, preparing him, instilling in him the absolute conviction that the crown of England was rightfully his through her claim. In 1149, Henry led his first military expedition to England. It didn't achieve much. He was young and inexperienced and short on funds. But it was a warning to Stephen that the struggle was far from over. By 1151, the political landscape had shifted. Geoffrey Plantagenet, Matilda's husband, died, and Henry inherited Normandy and Anjou. The next year, Henry married Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women in Europe, the divorced ex-wife of the King of France, who brought with her control of vast territories in southern France. At age 19, Henry controlled more of France than the French king did. In January 1153, Henry invaded England with a real army this time, not the ragtag force of mercenaries he'd brought before. The country was exhausted by nearly 2 decades of civil war. Barons on both sides were tired of fighting. The harvest had failed again. There had been plague. People just wanted peace, stability, a ruler who could hold the kingdom together, and Stephen's position had weakened. His wife, Queen Matilda, had died in 1152, his eldest. Son, Eustace, who had been actively fighting to secure his own succession, died suddenly in 1153, possibly from illness, though some chroniclers hinted darkly at divine judgment. Stephen was getting old, worn down by the endless struggle. He had no more stomach for war. Through the mediation of the Church, a settlement was negotiated. The Treaty of Wallingford, also called the Treaty of Winchester, was agreed upon in November 1153. Its terms were simple. Stephen would remain king for the rest of his life, but he would adopt Henry Plantagenet as his son and heir, passing over his own surviving children. When Stephen died, Henry would inherit the throne of England. It was, in effect, a recognition of Matilda's original claim. Henry was inheriting through his mother's rights. The barons who had sworn oaths to support Matilda back in 1127, who had broken those oaths to crown Stephen, were finally, belatedly, honouring those old promises. Just 1 generation late. Stephen died on October 25th, 1154. He was about 59 years old, completely exhausted. He was buried at Faversham Abbey, which he had founded. Less than 2 months later, on December 19th, 1154, Henry Plantagenet was crowned King Henry II of England at Westminster Abbey. He was just 21 years old, and he ruled an empire that stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. He would go on to be one of England's most effective medieval kings, reigning for 35 years, reforming the law, strengthening royal administration, and generally getting the kingdom back under control after the chaos of the Anarchy. And through him, Matilda's blood would flow through all subsequent English monarchs. Her son, her grandson, Richard the Lionheart, her great-grandsons. Every king and queen of England since Henry II has been her descendant. Matilda herself lived another 13 years after her son's coronation. She remained in Normandy, where Henry frequently consulted her on matters of governance and policy. She acted as his regent in Normandy when he was in England or elsewhere in his territories. Contemporary sources describe her as an astute political counsellor, someone Henry trusted and relied upon. She had never gotten her crown, never gotten her coronation, never gotten the formal recognition she deserved. But she'd gotten something perhaps more important. She had ensured that her bloodline would sit on the throne of England. She died on September 10th, 1167 at Rouen. She was 65 years old. She was buried at Bec Abbey in Normandy, as she had requested. Her epitaph read, "Great by birth, greater by marriage, greatest in her offspring. Here lies Matilda, the daughter, wife, and mother of Henry. Daughter of King Henry I, wife of Holy Roman Emperor Henry V, mother of King Henry II, not Queen, not ruler, not lady of the English, just daughter, wife and mother. As if all her struggles, all her battles, all her years of refusing to surrender had been only about the men in her life. This is the erasure we're talking about. Matilda's story has been systematically downplayed and forgotten. When most people learn about English history, they hear about William the Conqueror and his sons, then maybe a brief mention of the Anarchy, then on to Henry II and the Plantagenets. Matilda becomes a footnote, if she's mentioned at all, or she's portrayed as the villain of the story, the arrogant foreign empress who plunged England into civil war because she was too proud and too stubborn to accept her cousin's rightful claim to the throne. But that's not the real story. The real story is about a woman who was designated as heir by her father, supported by oaths sworn by every major baron in the kingdom. A woman whose cousin stole the throne through a rapid coup that violated all those oaths. A woman who fought for 19 years to reclaim what was rightfully hers. She didn't start the civil war, Stephen did, when he broke his oath and seized the crown. Matilda was fighting for justice, for her rights, for the succession her father had legally established. Yes, she made mistakes. The London incident, where her arrogance alienated the city at the crucial moment, was a catastrophic error of judgment. The decision to release Stephen in exchange for Robert of Gloucester is endlessly debatable. But these were human mistakes, the kind any ruler might make in the chaos of medieval warfare, and they need to be measured against her achievements. Matilda escaped from being besieged in a castle by walking through enemy lines in the middle of winter. She held together a coalition of supporters through nearly 2 decades of civil war. She successfully passed her claim to her son and lived to see him crowned king. She spent years after that serving as her son's trusted advisor. She was proclaimed Lady of the English by the Church itself. She issued royal charters. She governed. For several crucial months in 1141, Matilda was effectively the ruler of England. She held the royal treasury. She had the support of the Church. She was receiving homage from barons. She was doing everything a monarch did except wearing the crown. The only reason she wasn't crowned was because a mob drove her out of London before the ceremony could take place. So was Matilda really queen? Did she really rule? The answer depends on what you think makes someone a monarch. If you require a coronation ceremony, then no, Matilda was never queen. But Edward V, who appears in the official list of English kings, was never crowned either. He was king for less than 3 months before he was deposed and likely murdered by his uncle Richard III. Yet Edward is counted as a legitimate king because he was proclaimed as such, because he inherited the throne, because for those brief months he was the recognised ruler. By that standard, Matilda should absolutely be in the list of English monarchs. She was proclaimed Lady of the English. She inherited the throne through legitimate succession from her father. She ruled for at least as long as Edward V did, and considerably longer if you count the entire period she was fighting for her claim. The only reason she's not in the official regnal list is because of medieval attitudes about gender. The feeling that somehow a woman couldn't really be a true monarch, that the title, Lady of the English, was just a temporary placeholder rather than a real title of rulership. This is why Matilda deserves to be remembered, not just because her story is dramatic and compelling, though it absolutely is, not just because she was brave and fierce and refused to surrender, though all of that is true, but because she was actually functionally in every practical sense except the formal one, the first Queen Regnant of England. 400 years before Mary Tudor there was Matilda, and history has done her a grave disservice by forgetting that fact. There's something poignant about her burial inscription. Great by birth, greater by marriage, greatest in her offspring. It's meant to honour her, certainly, but it also diminishes her. It defines her entirely through her relationships to men, her birth through her father, her marriage to the emperor, her son the king. There's nothing there about her own accomplishments, her own strength, her own determination. If we were writing her epitaph today, knowing what we know about her life, what would we say? Here lies Matilda, Holy Roman Empress, Lady of the English, designated heir to the throne of England, warrior who fought for 19 years and never surrendered, mother of a dynasty, the queen they tried to forget. She was fierce in an age that demanded women be meek. She was proud in an age that demanded women be humble. She claimed power in an age that believed power belonged only to men. She lost her coronation but won the succession. She lost the crown but secured the throne for her son. She was erased from history, but she changed history nonetheless. And maybe that's the most important thing to remember about Matilda. She was never supposed to rule. Medieval society was built on the assumption that women couldn't and shouldn't hold power in their own right. The barons who swore oaths to her did so grudgingly, assuming it would never actually matter. When it came time to honour those oaths, they broke them without hesitation. When she actually came close to power, they rebelled against her, drove her from London, fought her for years, but she persisted. Against all the forces of medieval misogyny, against all the assumptions about what women could and couldn't do, against the entire weight of a society that insisted women should stay quiet and out of sight, Matilda fought. She claimed her rights, she refused to back down, she ruled in everything but name for long enough to prove that a woman could do it, and through her son, her blood has flowed, through the veins of every English monarch for the last 870 years, every single one. Henry II, Richard the Lionheart, King John, Henry III, the Edwards, the Henrys, Elizabeth I, Elizabeth II. All of them descended from Matilda, all of them carrying forward her bloodline. She lost the crown but won the dynasty. So here's to Matilda, Empress, Lady of the English, the first queen they erased from history. May her memory be a blessing, and may her story finally be told. If you enjoyed this deep dive into forgotten history, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel. History is full of incredible stories about people who shaped our world but got written out of the narrative. People like Matilda who deserve to be remembered. Let me know in the comments if there are other forgotten figures you'd like to see covered. And until next time, remember that history is always more complicated, more interesting, and more human than we usually give it credit for. Thanks for watching.